Global investment in data centers reached record highs in 2025, with deals totaling more than $61 billion.
The speed at which private capital has moved into the data center and AI space is unprecedented.
And that growth is only expected to continue. McKinsey expects that by 2030, data centers will need $6.7 trillion in investment to keep pace with demand for compute power, with about 70% of that demand expected to come from AI workloads.
Data centers essentially form the backbone of the internet. We're not just talking about AI, we're also talking about the apps you use.
Data processing is basically the brains of our digital civilization. The government relies on it, the industry relies on it, logistics, everything.
As data centers' electricity demand worldwide is expected to double by 2030, providers are already citing access to power as a top concern.
If I take our data centre in London, for example, we had our power connection a firm offer, and it was then moved by a decade. So how can you move forward into a multi-billion-pound project with a customer contract?
Across Europe, major hubs like London have become saturated and are increasingly facing restrictions. So where to build?
We're currently building out projects in Madrid in Spain and also in Seinäjoki in Finland. We're looking across the Nordics in particular, where they have cheaper power and more readily available land.
And that demand isn't just impacting local grids.
A lot of the data center construction is basically foreign direct investment. So it's large multinational companies investing in the Nordics. And as they do that, their political weight also increases.
So how are data centers redrawing Europe's grid map? And what risks come with that shift?
I want the future of AI to be made in Europe.
Europe wants to become an AI powerhouse, but in order to do that, it needs to have the infrastructure, which means it needs to have these data centers housing these advanced GPU chips and therefore being able to contribute to AI workloads. In order to have those data centers, it needs access to power.
Data centers used to mainly be built where the population and the industry are in Europe, and that means in the center of the heart of Europe. It's the so-called FLAP-D, Frankfurt, London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Dublin. They go to where electricity is available. And now data centers are migrating to the edges. On the one hand, to the Iberian Peninsula, there's lots of renewable, cheap energy there. And then the very other extreme of Europe, the Nordics. Also cool air, lots of renewables, wind, hydro, and a great quality grid as well.
While data center power capacity is still growing in Europe's traditional hubs, newer markets like the Nordics and Southern Europe are expanding at a much faster pace. This reflects rising demand. Countries with less grid congestion and shorter connection wait times are expected to see data center demand grow at nearly double the rate of FLAP-D hubs by 2030.
There's an absolute appetite for secondary and even tertiary markets.
As data center operators look for cleaner and more available power, interconnectors, the high-voltage cables linking national grids, are playing a bigger role in moving electricity across borders. Europe now has more than 400 of them, making it the world's largest interconnected grid. But that system is under pressure. In December 2025, the European Commission unveiled its Grids package to speed up permitting for energy infrastructure. It estimates 1.2 trillion euros in investment will be needed by 2040 to modernize the continent's electricity networks.
In the Nordics, in Finland in particular, the grid, there is a lot of capacity, but even here there's starting to be sort of local constraints. So for instance, there was a case in Sweden where a local bun bakery wanted to expand and they needed more access to the electricity grid. And at the same time, a large data center project wanted access to the grid. And the utility allocated it to the data center, and the bun factory was unable to expand.
These facilities are getting bigger and bigger, increasingly over 1 gigawatt.
1 gigawatt is an enormous amount of power for a single site, equivalent to the average annual electricity consumption of almost 1 million people.
In some areas, we're seeing operators face waiting times of 5, 8, sometimes even 10 years to connect to the grid. Take the UK, for example, where last year, companies applying to connect to the grid, there was a 460% jump in applications in a 6-month period. In order to kind of counteract that surge, the government is considering a proposal whereby projects that have more economic viability will get priority access. and that includes data centers. It's really interesting to contrast that example in the UK with the Netherlands, where traditionally grid applications work on a sort of first come, first served basis. But now they're kind of considering, instead, why don't we give priority access to other businesses that really need the power, for example, a hospital or a local school.
The European Council says expanding the grid will take both public and private money.
Traditionally, the electricity grid is considered a public utility that should be funded from public money. And then we have these questions, well, should we use this much public money to build infrastructure, which is then used by a small number of very large data center operators? We're looking at ways of involving also private money in investing in improving that grid capacity.
In fact, data center providers are already reshaping national grids in several ways, through financing, planning, and even on-site power generation. In Ireland, where data centers already account for 22% of electricity consumption, new grid connection rules introduced in 2025 raised the bar. Large-scale facilities now have to provide their own generation or storage and meet at least 80% of annual demand with new renewable projects in the country. In 2026, digital infrastructure developer Pure Data Center Group partnered with power supply solutions provider AVK to switch on Europe's first microgrid-connected data center in Dublin.
Effectively, we had a natural gas connection, but we weren't able to get a grid connection. And so to ensure that we could meet our customer requirements, creating a microgrid enabled us to move our project forward.
Here we have gas generation, we have battery storage, and we have HVO standby generation, all layered together that's providing redundant continuous power to the data center. If you just go with renewables, you end up building a significant amount of renewables and a lot of batteries. With the dispatchable power piece, you have your main power source being renewables, but in times where the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining, you're reverting to this microgrid.
For now, the microgrid operates independently of the main grid, but eventually it will need to connect.
When we do finally get a grid connection, we'll be able to offer dispatchable power. It will be able to balance off the renewables that are already on the grid in Ireland. If you think back to the days, go back 100 or so years when electricity grids were first being formed, they took a load of islanded, isolated assets in various villages and towns, and they connected them together and formed national grids in different countries. We're almost going back to that sort of stage where you might end up with these private grids being built out because of the long-endedness of power connections.
If we look at the evolution of preferences of the data center operators, what used to be a number in the 5 to 10% range of people who are willing to consider behind-the-meter solutions such as microgrids, that number has almost doubled in the last 18 months. And now 20% or more are considering the use of that.
The problem with requiring data centers to be self-sufficient in terms of electricity production is that means they will have to use quite small-scale electricity production. For instance, in the US, they're using a lot of gas turbines.
The second element is the actual reliability of the system, right? As we know, data centers like to operate with 5 nines reliability. Achieving that in a microgrid system, while possible, is difficult, just from a feasibility and technological standpoint.
From the point of view of planning and industrial geography that's as energy efficient, you really want to make sure that you're using renewables.
In Europe, a data center can take just 1 to 2 years to build. But getting connected to the grid can take up to a decade, which is why operators are working more closely with utilities and energy developers. Take Spain, for example, where Amazon Web Services and Microsoft have signed long-term renewable power deals with Repsol. These agreements help lock in electricity supply from major customers, while giving developers like Repsol the revenue certainty to finance new wind and solar projects.
The same is true in the Nordics, and I think the same will start to happen even in other places like Poland. There you're also seeing investment go in, capacity expansion for the manufacture of everything from gas turbines to electrical equipment like transformers, switchgears, etc.
We're seeing a new type of investor come in who's specifically interested in the microgrid itself, not necessarily the data center build. So they're infrastructure funds who are looking to build, own and operate microgrids and supply power to the data centers.
So, who stands to benefit from Europe's data center construction boom? Some of the biggest winners could be European electrical equipment, cooling and engineering firms, as well as utilities and grid operators. Over the past year, shares in some of Europe's biggest electrification companies have climbed as investors bet on rising demand from data centers.
It was a very strong start to the year for ABB, 24% order growth. Data centers up triple digit.
Take Schneider Electric, for instance, where data centers accounted for around 30% of its total orders in 2025. At Legrand, they made up 26% of revenues, and the company says that share could rise to as much as 40%.
Big tech and hyperscalers trying to adapt their projects to suit the country of where they're going. A really interesting example is Meta's Odense data center project in Denmark. In order to get that facility off the ground, there was upgrades and investment that needed to happen. So that therefore contributed to investment in the grid. And that project also took place with a sort of waste heat recovery program. So that meant that excess heat from the data center was providing heat for residential buildings.
This is known as district heating, and it's widely used across the Nordics, especially in cities. Data centers are becoming a growing source of that heat. In the port city of Hamina in southern Finland, waste heat from Google's local data center is expected to cover up to 80% of district heating demand from the end of 2025. But that growing interdependence also raises new questions around reliance, control, and digital sovereignty. Nearby in Mensela, Amsterdam-based Nebius had started to recover heat waste for residential use.
NVIDIA has just recently announced that they are investing $2 billion in a Netherlands-registered AI computation data center company called Nebius.
Nebius was once Yandex NV, the Dutch-registered parent company of Yandex, one of Russia's biggest tech companies. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the company came under geopolitical pressure, sold its Russia-based businesses, and rebranded as Nebius in 2024.
In April 2022, their major data center in Mäntsälä, Finland, which was heating the city, couldn't purchase electricity anymore, and they had to basically power down most of the operations.
The data center had to run on diesel at reduced capacity, and its contribution to the local heating system was disrupted.
The interesting thing is, not only as a result of computation moving northward, not only do other countries become more dependent on the Nordics, but also Nordics, in terms of basic infrastructure like heating, become more dependent on computation from other countries.
Geography is really important when it comes to thinking about where data centers are located and where the investment is going.
In a sort of ironic twist, one of Europe's digital sovereignty AI compute champions is actually former Russian digital champion. We have Nebius building further very large AI computation facilities in eastern Finland, quite close to the Russian border. Also, Google's major data center complex in Finland, also hundreds of megawatts in terms of total peak capacity, is located only about 40 kilometers from the Russian border.
As data centers migrate, the question is, will these new areas of growth see the same challenges that existed in those traditional markets? Can Europe invest fast enough to be able to support the grid and the infrastructure around it?
A lot of the discussion around the potential return of AI in general hinges on their ability to prove return from these data centers. Data centers also run a natural course of life.
In the area of AI compute, there's now a lot of industrial policy aimed at supporting with public funds the construction of local capacity here. Even if it's physically located here, a lot of the times in terms of ownership and investment and in terms of technology, it's still very much reliant on US in particular. We could accept some of that inbound investment, but de-weaponize it, make sure that it can't be used as a means of geopolitical pressuring against Europe.